Welcome back to the Fuel Your Legacy podcast. Each week, we expose the faulty foundational mindsets of the past and rebuild a newer, stronger foundation essential in creating your meaningful legacy. We've got a lot of work to do, so let's get started. As much as you like this podcast, I'm certain that you're going to love the book that I just released on Amazon, Fuel Your Legacy, The 9 Pillars to Build a Meaningful Legacy. I wrote this to share with you the experiences that I had while I was identifying my identity, how I began to create my meaningful legacy, and how you can create yours. You're going to find this book on Kindle, Amazon, and as always on my website, samknickerbocker.com. Well, welcome back to the Fuel Your Legacy show. And again, we're live on Facebook as well as recording for a future episode. I'm super excited for this. I've been looking forward to it, learning from Nick and hearing what he has planned for us and what he's got planned for the world with his new book. I like his branding. I like everything about it, and kind of excited to hear more of his experiences and why he is who he is. But for those of you on Facebook, if you're just tuning in, you are allowed and welcome to comment in the post, comment below, and then ask him questions. He's going to be sharing his story, but ask him questions. And as you ask the questions, I'll just funnel that right through and we'll ask him here live. And then we'll sign off and you'll get the rest of the podcast on the episode when it gets published here in a few weeks. His book comes out. What's the date that it comes out?
November 1st.
November 1st, just in time for Christmas. Give it to somebody who believes that they could be better, or maybe they don't quite believe that they could be better and they need to believe it. And the pathway is books. And if you're looking at his background, you'll see he's a reader, or he bought a lot of colored books. But my guess is he's a reader. And we're gonna find out what he's been reading. But just so you have an idea of who he is, Nick Hutchison is a visionary force behind BookThinkers, a thriving 7-figure marketing agency bringing authors and readers together. It's just over 7 years he's cultivated the platform, reaching over 1 million people monthly, and hosts the top 2 global podcasts. So think about that, the ability and reach that somebody has. And yet, there's always a need and desire to go out and be on other people's shows, not just your own, because there's so many values that you can share. So he's featured interviews with world-renowned people like Grant Cardone, Lewis Howes, and on his platform and services empower countless authors to reach millions more readers to drive substantial revenue growth in their business. So I'm super pumped to be sharing this with you. And I'm going to let him kind of introduce himself even more in detail, where he started, maybe back into his childhood, why he's so passionate about where he is. And you might be looking at him thinking he's still in his childhood. Oh, we both are. Okay. It's okay. Exactly. Yeah. We both are in our childhood still, especially compared to some of the people he's interviewed. We have a long life ahead of us. And so what is he going to be doing with the rest of his life? We're excited to hear all about it. Take it away.
Well, I appreciate the introduction. And yes, I'm 29 years young, turning 30 in December. Then I'll be officially a lot older. So when I was growing up, this might be hard for your audience to believe, especially with the shelves behind me. Maybe it'll be a surprise for you, Samuel, but I was not much of a reader growing up. So up until the age of 20, you couldn't get me to read a book. I was more of the athlete stereotype, not much of the academic. But everything changed for me going into my senior year of college, because I took a sales internship at a local software company. And my boss at the time introduced me to the world of podcasting. He basically said, Nick, I know you have an hour commute here, an hour commute home. You can listen to the same song for the 1,000th time, but that's not going to get you closer to where you want to be in life. Try a personal development podcast. So I dove in head over heels. I fell in love with podcasting. And what I realized one day was that every single one of these people being interviewed on the shows, they were giving at least some credit, a little bit of credit for the success they've experienced to the books that they were reading. Now, here I am deliberately choosing not to read books, which sounds kind of goofy in hindsight, but that also meant that I was deliberately choosing to live under my potential, because these nonfiction business personal development style books condense decades of somebody else's lived experience into days of potential learning. That's how you can accelerate through life. They're like a shortcut. $20 in a few hours of your time, and you can learn millions or billions of dollars worth of lessons. And so I went to my local Barnes & Noble, got a few books, went back to that internship, closed the door, and I started reading, and I haven't turned back since. So over the last 10 years or so, I've read about 500 books. I've created my dream life. I just got married in May, traveled to over 25 different countries, sometimes for up to a few months at a time. Bought my dream home, just got a puppy. My business grew from a side hustle to employing 10 people. We serve hundreds of authors a year. And I realized that life doesn't have to be so hard. And that if you have the right strategies, you can use these books, implement what you learn, and create the life that uniquely fulfills you. And so that's why I decided to write this book, Rise of the Reader, Strategies for Mastering Your Reading Habits and Applying What You Learn. The application piece is very important. There's a quote I read recently by Napoleon Hill. It says, action is the real measure of intelligence. So we're not just reading these books to sound smart. We're reading these books to change our lives. And so that's who I am, what we do. 2 seconds on the business. We help authors promote and market their books. 2 seconds on the book. Read it, because if you choose to read anything else before reading this book, there's an opportunity cost to that. You're not getting as much as you could. And let me teach you how. So that's my intro.
Hey, I love it. And I think that it's something that a lot of people have struggled with. A lot of people need better understanding of how to accomplish this. Let's go back though. You're 29 and you started really at 20. What was your family upbringing like? Like how many siblings? Where did you grow up? What was that like that led you to maybe thinking that reading was for the birds, and why read?
Yeah, I'm not sure it was a family influence. I think it was more of a school influence. I love my parents and my siblings. I grew up in the Boston, Massachusetts area playing sports. I have 3 younger brothers. We're all within 5 years of each other. So, the 4 of us plus my dad, that's a basketball team right there. And my parents were very supportive. I like to say that typical white picket fence, all the opportunities, didn't really grow up, thinking about food on the table or vacations or presents under the Christmas tree, because we always had them. But in my school environment, a traditional public school system, I think there's a lot to be desired as far as that's concerned. When I was really little, I had some insecurity around my ability to communicate effectively. And getting up in front of the class and presenting or reading a paragraph in one of those little circles, like that was always very intimidating for me. And I have some pretty traumatic experiences from grade school up through middle school and high school when that did not go well in front of a classroom and kind of getting laughed at. And so that compounded. And one of the issues with the traditional public education system, I think, is that they teach you that failure is not a good thing, right? You want to avoid failure. But in the real world, when you start your own business, failure is the best teacher. You want to fail as fast and as often as possible. So why did I not read? Well, because the classes that I had to read the most were also the classes where you had to present in front of everybody else. I was an AP calculus student, but I really stunk at English and history and Spanish because I had this insecurity around presenting in front of other people and my ability to communicate. So I think that's probably where it came from. But, a little bit of additional context. I was captain of the wrestling team. I played football. My senior year, we got to play in Gillette Stadium on live TV. And I loved sports, but that's because I didn't have to communicate with my mouth. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that does hold a lot of people back. And I think it's the little things that people are often unaware of that is holding them back. And it's the things one of the things that I've got a lot of out of reading was actually being invited to go back and reanalyze, well, where did that belief come from? Where did that belief come from? Where did that belief come from? And so something that you talked about, you didn't read much till you're 20, then you entered sales and you had a really good mentor who kind of kicked your butt and said, hey, go do this. At what point did you determine to start your own podcast?
A couple years later, I had already started this company, BookThinkers, as a little bit of a side hustle. It started as a way for me to share the books that I was reading and connect with like-minded people. There were a few failed attempts at monetizing that passion that I had for reading before it became a little bit more successful. But once I started to do paid book reviews and authors would pay me to review their books for my audience, I started to think of how else can I develop these relationships with my author clients. And one of the ideas was podcasting. I saw that so many of my favorite authors were following our account. They were commenting on my book reviews of their books. And so I had follow-up questions after reading these books. So I thought, why not invite them to a conversation and document it for the world, right? And turned out to be exactly what happened. I've interviewed so many of my favorite authors, and I get to have these kind of like cool one-on-one coaching experiences with these really rare people and put the podcast out to the rest of the world.
So with that kind of process, I went through a similar process, but I didn't have the same intention. And so my outcome was different. And I'm not sure where I would rather my outcome be. Frankly, I've thought about it. I have had the opportunity to interview a few of my favorite authors, but it did start for me as not just podcasting, but the whole thing. I was reading a book a week. And then I heard from one of my mentors is like, look, you're sure reading a lot, but what are you doing with it? And I was like, touche, it is better. I mean, it is better listening to books than listening to the same song every day. Just like it's better to listen to a podcast than listen to the same song every day. Like clearly there's good, better, best there, but sure, still, if you're listening to a bunch of books and not acting on it, then what muscle is that building? On the one hand, what goes through you will stick to you. So you'll make incremental small changes. But on the other hand, you're also building the muscle of complacency, building the muscle and the resistance against good ideas because you're not actually putting it. So your brain says, oh, I've heard that before, but you've never done it. So you feel like you're an expert who has no experience. It's the funniest thing. And so that's something that for me, I noticed that I was going through in my early 20s is like, man, this is not productive. So I actually cut back how many books a year I was reading. And said, look, before I cut back how many books a year I was reading, I stuck with one a week, but I did a podcast book review every week. So I want to stay on this vein because you said, well, you got to the point where you were in paid book reviews. Were you doing book reviews and doing like affiliate links with those before, or was the first thought of like, I could make money doing a book review when somebody offered to pay you? Like, how did that genesis come into play?
Well, first, I just want to mention that, pat yourself on the back for paying more attention to the application, because that's why I wrote the book that I wrote. How do you get more out of these books? How do you implement them into your life? To your question directly, I tried affiliate links, but when you have a small audience and Amazon only pays you 4 to 8 cents per book that you sell, there's no money opportunity there. So the real first successful form of monetization was definitely being paid by authors. And nowadays, if you want me to review your book, it's thousands of dollars. Back then, it was $50 here, $50 there, which, by the way, at 8 cents a piece, that's a lot of books that you would have to sell through an affiliate model to make that happen.
Sure. So, but how did you go about being introduced to the idea of how did that initial transaction happen? Because it's like a good idea, but there's a lot of people who have great ideas. But again, they don't know how to like market to the right person, get the person to commit to paying and do a book review and have enough value. I could say, look, I'll do a book review for $50. But at the end of the day, they're going to say, well, why would I pay you $50 to do a book review? So how did you present that? Walk us through that.
The very first dozen times, authors came to me. So authors said, hey, Nick, your audience looks like my target reader. Can I pay you for a book review? And at the time I thought, oh, wow, I had no idea that was even an option. What would this person pay? So I would say $50. And then the next time I'd say $75. Then the next time I'd say $100. And of course, as I'm reading these business books and applying them, I'm following up with these people. Can you please refer me to other authors? And then I started to prospect. I'd send authors DMs through our book account. And I'd say, hey, congratulations on the release of your book. I'd love to share it with my audience. We do paid book reviews where I actually do a deep dive on your book and share my favorite takeaways with your audience. Would you be interested in paying us X amount for a book review? Right. And these authors are thinking, okay, I make $5 a book, $10 a book, $20 a book, depending on what it's priced at. How many books would I have to sell to break even or be ROI positive on this investment that this guy's trying to pitch me on? And so over time, my discovery process improved. My understanding of the book industry improved. The way that I positioned and sold offers and executed them improved. And so it was just a slow incremental process that originated by authors like having some sort of demand for this.
Awesome. So was it mostly trial and error that you learned these things about the book industry or whatever? Or was there a point where you said, if I want to turn this from like a side income that I'm still testing out to, I want to become freaking professional and amazing at it, that you took time out and started studying a lot more. How do I approach this? And how do I, because at some point you're talking to publicists, you're not talking to the even author. You're saying, look, publicists, this is a good avenue for you to spend money on the overall book publishing. I would assume that at some point you hit the publicist, not the author.
That internship that I took in college, I followed through with it full time after school. So I'm working in this professional sales capacity, growing as a salesperson in a small business, flying all around the country, brokering deals, understanding how the small business works on somebody else's dime, while I'm filtering that skills transfer into my side hustle. So as I was presented with problems and issues in this side hustle, I'm posing those questions at work, my 9 to 5, and then my 9 to 5, or then my 5 to 9. So I think that's where a lot of that original framework came from. I think, I had a lot of friends in school and their goal was to go get the biggest name on their business card. But what happened is they'd end up getting coffee for years. And so what did I do? I went to a small business where I could sit in these big meetings on day one and learn from people and get access to the founders and the top salespeople and pick their brains and then apply what I was learning to my own sales stuff for them, but also into my side hustle. And then I think, through trial and error, that's really how it happened. I mean, I started to understand the 80-20 of selling. What 20% of relationships can drive 80% of my revenue? Well, those are the people that work with the authors, publishers, PR companies, publicists, etc. And so I started to approach those types of companies and say, what do you need? What do you need help with? And social media for them, especially at the time, 5-6 years ago, was the wild, wild west. Nobody wanted to touch it. And so I said, well, hey, I'm a low-cost option for you to get a better understanding of how this works, because we're working with 1 author a week, 2 authors a week, 3 authors a week. Send us authors. It's low ticket right now while I'm figuring things out. And I'm a sponge. I just want to learn, I'll put in the work. And so, I think it was a trial and error thing. I don't think there was ever this big pause and study session or anything like that.
Awesome. I love it. And I want to highlight one of the things you said, the skills transfer. So many people overlook that. They think they're in this career and they're just stuck in this career and they have no skills outside of the little cog in the wheel that they're performing. And something I always say to encapsulate this is, if you're a W-2 employee, by definition, you're underpaid, because that company's obviously making more money on you than you're being paid, or they would fire you. So your skills and what you're providing are more valuable in the marketplace than what you're being compensated for. That's just as every business owner does it. You have employees, you're paying your employees to do something that you're getting more value from them doing than if you were to do it. Because if you didn't, you wouldn't pay them. It's basic 101 that people don't think that simply about life. Oh, my position's really important. They're never going to get rid of me. Yeah. Oh, wait, just wait,
Yeah. And if you're a W-2, you're receiving post-tax income and you're not using pre-tax money on everything that you could be, your car, your gas, what I mean? So
everything.
Exactly.
It just goes on and on. But I think it's important to recognize, for everybody listening, make an inventory of your skills and then think of a side hustle, something, and it doesn't have to be really even correlative, right? What you're doing as far as the book thinkers, that's not necessarily part of what you were doing before, although there's elements of sales that apply in both places. There's elements of book business structuring, protection, legal places. There's elements of all of that in every business, and not just business, but in every family and every relationship. And so understanding how to have those skills transfer, I think it's an under recognized skill. And frankly, I don't know that I should say this. You've probably read more books than me. I don't know very many books that specifically focus on helping somebody identify the skills that they're doing and how they could transfer.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'll say something else that I think is a really interesting point in my story. I used to be really insecure of this, and now I tell it on podcasts and Facebook Lives. So I was told very early in my journey, when I was about to make a jump, full-time book thinkers, don't do it. Be patient. Michael Gerber says 95% of small businesses fail in the first 5 years. Why? Because they run out of money. So here I am, I'm confident, I'm blissfully ignorant, and I want to make a jump. And I have a mentor say, don't try to build a parachute on the way down. Build the parachute and then jump from a place of certainty. Otherwise, you'll operate from a place of scarcity and uncertainty. You'll compromise on your values. You'll discount your services. You'll run out of money, and then you'll give up. So what did I do? I built slowly, making those small iterations over time. And this is the home run point that I used to be really insecure of. BookThinkers was a business doing over $100,000 a year in revenue with full-time employees, and I still have my W-2. Why? Because it allowed me to operate and mess up and fail over and over and over again without ruining my business. Actually, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year before I took the jump. And so by the time I took the jump, I had already delegated all the stuff that I didn't want to do. I had already built a business with other people operating on my behalf. And it wasn't a risky situation anymore. It was a calculated situation. And I feel like so many businesses fail. And those people that fail, they're not the ones on the podcast, right? The people on the podcast being interviewed typically are the 1 out of 20 that actually succeeded, not the 19 out of 20 that failed. BookThinkers failed over and over and over and over and over again. And if I had jumped too soon, I wouldn't be here to tell that story.
Well, and also I want to highlight though, you're 29 years old and you started, like you got told about listening to podcasts, not even books, but told about listening to podcasts when you were 20. So some people would say 9 years, that's not slow. That's really fast, right? And I think that this is another thing that people aren't always thinking about. They think that, I was actually talking to a potential business partner today where he's saying, look, how fast can I get into money? Like how fast does something become profitable? I'm like, well, depends on what you ask, right? If you're thinking in addition, which is where most employees think, they think, hey, I've got to do this, 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 and it's going to add up to a good decision. Entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs, let me rephrase that. Successful entrepreneurs don't think in terms of addition. They think in terms of multiplication. And so if you can duplicate yourself and duplicate and duplicate and duplicate, then what seems like 9 years and maybe the first 5 or 6 years, nothing was happening, or it didn't look like anything was happening because it was very small incremental compounding. But in the last 4 or 5 years, you go to a multi-million-dollar business and you're interviewing the top of everybody. And people are like, where'd this guy come out of nowhere? He didn't come out of nowhere. He's been working on this for 9 years. And you're seeing him now, but he's been here for a long time, putting the work and learning and mastering his craft in perpetuity so that he can be there confidently. And I think that's something else people don't, they think, oh, I don't want to wait a long time. Is 9 years really a long time? 9 years is pretty fast.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think reading and implementing books is a way to accelerate time as well, because you're condensing decades of somebody else's lived experience into days of reading. So here I am, I'm 29 years young, right? But if you include all of the life experience I've learned from behind me, I'm thousands of years old. I have thousands of years of wisdom applied into the last 9 years. Here's another way to think about it. Decision making. So many people take a month or months to make decisions. If you could speed that up, yes, you'll fail a little bit faster, but through that failure, you will learn and iterate. And so I try to make decisions as fast as possible, knowing that action is better than inaction in any scenario. Because even if I fail, iterate, fail again, iterate, fail again, iterate, now I'm ahead of where I would have been if I never made the decision in the first place to act.
Yeah. And I think that I wrote this down when you're talking about fail fast and often as possible. And I think that that's something that often gets not spoken of in that quote, but like the iteration is important. If you're just doing the same failure over and over, hey, they said fail often as possible. I'm going to fail and do the same thing over and over and keep failing. Don't do that. Okay. Like stop failing. If that's the situation, go get a W-2 job and provide for your family. But if you're willing to like change and not believe that what you tried the first time that didn't work is the right thing, then you can have a wonderful life as long as you're willing to make adjustments. And that doesn't get said in that quote. Fail as fast as possible and often. You better freaking iterate what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the positions that I had, we didn't cover this time period before, but before the internship, but still while I was in college, I ran my own house painting business for 2 summers. And I had to do all of the door-to-door selling to generate leads. And so what you learn very early in that experience is that every no gets you a little bit closer to a yes. So let's say you average a yes out of every 100 doors. No's are part of that process. So if you put in the numbers, you'll eventually get there. But you can't just, every time somebody says no, you can't just say the next thing at the next door and hope somebody's going to say yes. You have to learn and iterate and grow and change your scripts and learn how to model behavior and everything like that. So yeah, that was a really good experience for me too.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what are, I'm going to ask more questions in detail, but I want to ask this really quick. If you were to say like the top 5 ways to implement, what would you say are the top 5 ways to just implement what you're hearing in a book?
I think it starts by setting the right intention for each book that you read, because that's going to set you up for the right opportunity to take action. And we could do a deep dive on that in a minute. I think the next piece is effective note-taking, because effective note-taking, again, is a precursor for taking better action. I think number 3, you want to think about retention. Only if you can remember information can you truly live it. So systems for retention, I think that's a really important precursor for action. Now I'll mention just 2 quick ways that you can take better action. One is by building an activity tracker. As Peter Drucker says, what's not being measured can't be managed. You can't manage improvement if you don't understand where you're currently at as far as a baseline is concerned. So you have to build an activity tracker, which I teach you how to do in the book, that measures your existing lead versus lag lead activity and what the results are. And then the 5th thing that I'll mention is building an accountability group. Life is complex enough as you try to navigate it by yourself. So you might as well make it a little bit easier by having other people hold you accountable. If you go to snooze the alarm at 7, you're far more likely to get out of bed if somebody's actually waiting at the gym for you, right? So have people in your corner that support you in every area of your life, that push you to be better, that challenge you when necessary. And I could talk a little bit about how to build that accountability group and how often it should meet and stuff later in more detail too.
Sure. Well, I'm super grateful for you sharing that. We're actually going to sign off of Facebook. So if you want to hear the deep dive into each of these, and you're going to need to go listen to this episode when it drops right the week of November 1st, the Friday, either before or on November 1st. I don't know what day that is, but it'll drop then. So you can listen to the remainder of this podcast. In the meantime, put a notification on your Facebook so you're alerted next time we do these live podcasts, so you can ask questions of the guests and get your answers. Because otherwise you get to hear my questions, which are freaking good questions, by the way. But if you want some of your own questions answered, then go ahead and push the reminder button so you know when the next one is. And we'll see you guys later. Awesome. So let's dive into this. Because when I started my podcast, I mentioned I started with the intention to apply more. And so I was doing a book review. When I started my podcast, I was way overzealous, honestly. The whatever it's called, naive, blissfully naive about what I was doing. Absolutely. I started doing 3 podcasts a week and doing them, recording, editing, posting, everything on the same day I was doing it. And I wanted them all to be out by 10 a.m. And it was rough. That's just the best way to describe it. It was rough. And I would do my thoughts on topic, and then on Monday, and then on Wednesday, I would do a book review, which means I had to read a book in between those every Wednesday. And then I would, on Friday, interview either the author of that book when I could get them to come on, or I would interview somebody who was an expert in that field or in that course of study. And so I learned a lot, like tons and tons and tons. I still think that operated more as a audio journal than it did an actual implementation strategy. And so I think that this is where I'm curious. How did you ever see your podcast as more of an audio journal, or was it more of just like all implementation? Because you mentioned that you were doing book reviews so other people could hear what you're learning, but how much of that was implementation?
Great question. In the beginning, not much of it was related to implementation, but over time, I realized that's what most people struggle with, and that's what I was really good at. So it sort of became my specialty. Our podcast doesn't focus too much on implementation. The podcast, admittedly, is more of an opportunity to borrow the credibility of these high-powered guests and leverage them for our business. I do try to get into the weeds sometimes, especially with the right person. Like we just had Alex Hormozy on our podcast. And so we got into the weeds a little bit, talking about some deep business concepts. But I think, not much in the beginning, more over time. I think our social media content for sure is focused on implementation now. And now that this book is available, we're getting even more into the weeds. And I think that that's what my brand will be in the future. Like the implementation guy, the action guy. That's right. Definitely my vibe.
No, I like it. When I first started podcasting, I listened to like the podcasts that I listened to in the beginning. I don't even know if they're still around. But EO Fire with
John Lee Dumas.
John Lee Dumas and Ed Milet. I still listen to his. Grant Cardone, Lewis Howes. I listen to a lot of his. Tony Robbins. Other guy who has like really long ones. Joe Rogan. Listen to all of them to kind of find my style and what I like to do on a podcast. How do I like it to run? What's that process? But I think I'm grateful that you said it because let's be honest, that's why I do mine as well. It's a way to borrow the credibility of the guests that you have on, and it's a way to learn and provide value to them, right? It's not one-sided. Obviously, we want the value, but his value is also that he's interviewing people who would pay him tens of thousands of dollars to review his book. So it's a mixture of both. You're borrowing value, but you're also offering a lot of value, and it's a win-win situation for both people. So that's huge. Now let's get into the intention behind a book. So I want to talk about this because in my process of reading books, some books are short and you can read them in like 2 hours. Other books like Money Master the Game or Principles by Ray Dalio are like these books that are like 34 hours long on Audible. Like they're not short books. And if you're reading it, you better be really fast at reading because they're like textbook details, which is phenomenal. And they deserve to be that. And I'm grateful that they are what they are. But when you're reading a book, at least initially, did you ever lean towards the Blinkist type? Oh, I read that book. Because I've run across people who are like, I've read all these books. And really they listen to like the cliff notes of the book. And sometimes that's good enough because they only give you enough of like, hey, the most actionable points. But I'm just curious, like, what's your thoughts on those services and how those work as far as implementation goes?
Yeah, I'm not a fan at all. I'll be totally honest there. I think Blinkist is a total waste of time unless you're using it to discover the next book that you read, to get a little taste of the book before you choose to read it. Early in my journey, I read a book called The Art of Learning by Joshua Waitzkin. And Joshua, multi-time chess champion, multi-time mixed martial arts champion, two completely different fields of study. And he was an expert at both of them. And what he said was that he would study a subject, let's say chess, so intensely that it would become part of his subconscious. And that when he was in a chess match, his subconscious could act on his behalf. It would see things that he couldn't consciously see. Why? Because he studied it so intensely that it became part of him. A book summary is not going to do that for you, but an entire book with all of the case studies and, all of the additional stories and information, it might get you there. Maybe you've got to read a few different books on the same subject, then you'll get there. So this shortcut, this Blinkist opportunity, I say toss it out. Not a fan.
I agree with you. I was just curious from your perspective, because the other part of this is, and I like what you did say about where it might fit in your, as a tool, right? And there's a lot of things in life that are great tools that are being misused as a shortcut when really they weren't ever intended to be a shortcut. Admittedly, I don't know the creator of Blinkist, so I don't know what their intention was. But how do you go into a book setting an intention if you don't know what the book is about? I guess you just read the cover. What's your process of determining what you want to get out of the book before you go into it?
Well, I suppose we would go even earlier into the process. Sometimes I meet people and I say, what are you reading? And they'll tell me, and I say, why? And they'll go, what do you mean, why? Why are you reading the book that you're reading? If you don't know why you're reading the book, I think that's the first place that we want to start. How do we choose a good book for us? I think books, especially in the nonfiction space, all of the titles that you're mentioning, they can solve pain that we're experiencing on a regular basis, or they can help us develop a skill set that gets us closer to where we want to be. Those are sort of the two main reasons that I choose to read a book. So I'm not going to read a book unless I'm paid to read it. I'm not going to read a book in my free time aimlessly. I'm going to read something that solves a direct problem in my life or helps me build a skill set that I know I need help in. So setting an intention, let's say that this book is going to help solve a problem. I have this book next to me because I just got it in. I haven't started the physical copy yet or anything, but this is $100 Million Leads by Alex Hormozi, How to Get Strangers to Want to Buy Your Stuff. So when I think about this book, I think about a pain that I have in my business, lead generation. It's something that is a weakness, admittedly, and that I need to improve. So I'm going to build an intention, a goal for this book, and it's going to follow the SMART goal framework. It's going to be specific, measurable, so I know whether or not I achieved the goal, attainable, not $100 million by next week, but I'll tell you the intention in a minute, actionable, relevant to my life, and written down on the inside cover, which I'll talk about in a minute, and time bound. You want to give yourself a deadline to finish and implement something from each book. So my intention for this will probably be something like find and implement at least 2 strategies for lead generation at BookThinkers by the end of the month. Because, and I'm going to spice it up a little bit, because admittedly, lead generation has been a weakness in the business. And whenever people ask about it, I never have great answers. I know we could be doing a better job. And so I'm going to write that intention on the inside cover of the book so that each and every time I open this up and read a few more pages, I review the intention and my brain can filter for those 2 strategies. I'm far more likely to take action if I know exactly what I'm looking for in each book that I read. Now, we could talk about note-taking strategies in a minute, but I'll say that by the end of reading this book, I may have 20 different strategies that I could implement. That's not realistic. So what I'll do is I'll write them all out, which is a form of repetition, and I'll look for what are the 20% of these actions that I could take that might lead to 80% of the results. Not every action is created equal. Some of them have more leverage than others. And so those are the ones that I'm going to take action on. That's how I set an intention for each book that I read.
Awesome. No, you answered some of my questions in the process. So roughly, and again, everybody's reading skills are different. And I think that the more you read, the better you'd be, obviously. But what's roughly like your pages per minute that you're able to read at this point, years into reading?
I can read 2 pages a minute typically, and maybe that's 400 words a minute, maybe a little bit more. It depends on the book. Every book is created differently. I'll say this. When somebody's first starting, so if somebody in the audience is like 400 words a minute, that's ridiculous. When you're first starting, I recommend putting 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the evening. You can replace a low impact activity like scrolling on social media, or replace the first 15 minutes of something like watching Netflix or HBO. Not the whole thing. I'm not a robot. Like I still watch some TV, but just 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes in the evening. If you're just starting, at 30 minutes, maybe you'll get 15 to 20 pages done. Let's say 20 pages. 5 days a week, that's 100 pages a week. Nowadays, many of these books average about 200 pages. That's a book every 2 weeks. Just by replacing a little bit of scrolling in the morning and a little bit of watching Netflix in the evening. That's how fast you can change 20 areas of your life over the course of the next year. So even if you're reading slowly, I think that's okay. It's better to read than watch Netflix. It's better to read than scroll mindlessly on Instagram, or like you said, watch that, listen to that song for the 10,000th time.
And do you use Audible to read along with? So you're hearing it and you're reading it, or are you just reading it, just listening to it? So some of both.
So all 3. So I'm just reading, I'm just listening, or I'm reading and listening. It's a combination of all 3. The audiobook is not always available for the books that I'm reading. If it's a super long book and maybe it's a memoir, like Elon Musk by Walter Isaacson just came out, that is something that there's probably not a ton of action for me to take from it. So I choose just to listen to it while I'm in the car. If a book like this, $100 Million Leads, something that I really want to take action from, and there are frameworks in the book and stuff, I'm going to choose just to read this, or maybe read plus listen to it.
Okay, cool. We're gonna run out of time. Suck. Okay, so your system of note taking, you did talk a little bit about as far as like strategies. I probably don't want to spend a ton of time there, but maybe just one or two things that you feel like are helpful. Maybe like a nomenclature that you use to say, hey, this is a new thought I need to adopt. This is a new action. This is something I need to tell somebody else to do. This is something I need to delegate. Like, how are you structuring what you're taking?
So I do have all of that available in my book, Rise of the Reader. So like you said, for the sake of time, maybe I'll just highlight a couple of things. Number one, reading a book and taking notes are two completely separate activities, and they should be done at separate times. So when I'm reading a book, I review my intention. When I catch something that's related to my intention, I'll make a little note, bracket it off, highlight it, and I will not stop reading. Because again, you don't want to get out of that momentum. Jim Quick has a great analogy for this. He says, if you're driving through a neighborhood really slow, your mind starts to wander. You're looking at license plates, cars, houses, furniture on the porch, whatever. But if you're speeding through that neighborhood as fast as possible, your eyes are glued to the road. That's how I like to read. So I like to read, and then I like to take notes. I'll go back to the things that I've annotated. I'll reflect on them separately. I'll rewrite them, and then I'll take action on the highest leveraged activities related to my intention, or delegate, or look up a quote, or buy a book like you're talking about.
Okay, so then again, I don't want to take too much out of the book, but I just think that these flow kind of nicely into each other. The system for retention, obviously repetition is important. I talk a lot about how writing down things from a psychological perspective, dendrite connection, changing your brain pathways, super important to actually write it down, not just think about it, not just feel about it, but actually commit to a word to define what you're feeling and then determine whether or not you actually feel the way that word suggests you to feel. So I think that that's important. But what other elements other than the process that you've described in intention, reading, reviewing, creating your list, what other elements are in your system of retention?
If you can get your highest leverage notes into an online notebook that's easily searchable, you can systematically review that information following what I detail in the book. It's called the forgetting curve. And so the more often you review something up front, the longer you can go without reviewing it, but still retaining it because that neural connection has been strengthened. And then every so often you start daily, then you go weekly, then you go monthly, then you go quarterly, you re-review that information to strengthen the connection again. And that improves retention. And I'll say something else that people probably won't love to hear, but this is one of my favorite things to ruffle some feathers. I love to rip pages out of a book. If something catches my attention and that's exactly what I was looking for, I'm going to rip that page out of the book and carry it around with me all day so that I can review it maybe a dozen times, 24 times in one day. For instance, here's a page that I just ripped out of a book and I'm keeping it on my desk so that I can see it consciously and subconsciously all day, every day.
That's phenomenal. I love that. So you mentioned like an online note-taking system that's searchable. And I'm assuming that same thing. And I'm driving people to the book because I think they all need to get it. But this is also something that is going to have a nomenclature or a systematic way to do that, not just hey, find something, this thing. And what you use as the online searchable thing is not as important as how you're putting in the keywords to search it and tag it. So, hey, I can search leadership and I'm going to get a bunch of leadership things that I've taken away, or dealing with internal company problems. Okay, well, that's going to get HR. I guess that's what they call that, human resources. But, so having it be searchable, I don't know. So thank you. I want to talk about this next one the most. So how tied to your activity tracker, because you talked about how you're going to teach somebody how to build one, which I think is phenomenal. How tied to your activity tracker is the initial intention? And the reason I ask that is we all have lots of different activities that we do every day. And it's really easy to just say, I'll track my key indicators for my business and see how those change. But then when you're learning something, I don't think it's a completely terrible thing to do, but while you're learning something about your relationship, maybe the activity tracker for your business isn't the area where you are going to be finding the most alterations. Although I believe that success in your relationship will lead to improved factors in your business, I don't think that that's where I would use that activity tracker to track my relationship. So I guess how tied is that to the intention before you even go into the book?
It's somewhat tied. I totally understand what you're saying. My activity tracker is more of a personal thing than it is a business thing. It has both variables tied to it, and my team has one that's business only, right? But let's say that you're looking to improve your relationship and you just read the 5 love languages, and you go through that process with your spouse and you realize that they're looking for more gifts or something like that. Maybe in your activity tracker, you set a goal to gift something to your spouse because that's their top love language once a week. And you're measuring it and you know if you fail to achieve it. And once you start to get to once a week, maybe you put the goal as twice a week. And as you're analyzing this activity tracker, you're consciously improving your relationship by purchasing something or, your time, whatever, and gifting it to your spouse. And so I think that this activity tracking concept that I've developed and I've been using for a long time, I think it could be modified to incorporate something in every area of our life.
So so just to be clear, is your activity tracker generally a more general areas of your life? And you're saying, okay, this is my baseline when I started this book. How did my life as a life quotient improve, maybe fulfillment or whatever your dreams are? I track my life off of faith, family, fitness, finance, and fun. Those are like the 5 things that I'm very conscious of. They're in my affirmations every morning. I'm saying, hey, these are the things I want to accomplish. Am I perfect? No, not yet. If ever, but I'm conscious of, hey, I want to call 2 family members every Wednesday. Do I do it every Wednesday? Sometimes I forget. I want to call my parents every Sunday. Do I do it every Sunday? I haven't gotten to every Sunday yet. So, and those are things that I'm reading that I'm conscious every morning of, hey, this is going to be your new habit. This is going to be your new habit. So that's interesting just to hear like what type of activities you're tracking.
All of that. Yeah. For me, I break it down into health, wealth, and happiness related, blocks of activity, and anything could go in there. It's how many times did you go to the gym this week? How many sales calls did you make today? Did you call, your parents on Sunday? Like all of that stuff can be put into this tracker and then quantified for that kind of life quotient, like you're talking about. So add up all of the goal. You have a goal to do something a certain time per week. You can weight them differently in the template that I show everybody how to build and duplicate. So maybe like calling your parents on Sunday is worth 10 points out of 100, whereas going to the gym is only worth 2 or something like that. So you can weight everything differently. And then you can look at the end of the week, like last week was a 60. Next week, I want to get to 65. And so you can start to manage improvements that way.
Okay. And then one last question about the online retention system. So you're writing all this stuff down, sounds like with a pen and paper, taking your notes, your 20 things, circling, like really doing that. What's the process of getting those from paper notes or paper journals into an online searchable journal? Do you have an assistant do that, or are you there typing it in, speaking it in? What's the goal? What's the process there?
I'm typing just the 20% of those notes that are most valuable into the online notebook, because that's another act of repetition. So just like physically writing, typing is the same thing. I mean, it's not as strong as physically writing is, but again, it's another form of repetition.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I just wanted to highlight those different areas because I think that if we can visualize a funnel of this, there's the top line activity, which is all of this starts with podcasts too. I was just driving down the road the other day and I was like, these podcasts I listen to, probably 6 to 10 hours of podcasts every week. And sometimes I take notes and sometimes I'm just driving down the road. And some of the people like Ed Milet, Hormozy, they've started to say, look, if you're driving, pull over, write this down. It's like, I'm driving down the freeway at 80 miles an hour. Do I pull over? And then they're like, if you're the one who didn't pull over, then you're the little idiot. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, you're right. I should have pulled over. But it's just fascinating to think like, okay, what if I had the opportunity to be on a coaching call with Ed Milet or with Lewis Howes or with Nick, right? Would I sit here and just be like, I'm just going to passively listen and be distracted? Or I'm going to be like, okay, I'm going to write down everything you say, what has application or not, just because you said it and you took time to speak to me. And I promise you this, if you're listening to this podcast or anywhere else, if you called Nick and got on a one-on-one with him, he's not going to tell you anything different than what he's telling you right now, other than what he wrote in his book, obviously, which is why you should go read the book, because he doesn't have 3 hours to go tell you everything he wrote in his book. That's why he wrote a book about it. Okay. Same for me. If you call me, you're going to get my thoughts, and my thoughts aren't changing just because I'm on a podcast versus in front of you. And same with any other leader. their thoughts aren't changing. I mean, obviously we're all evolving, so there's changing a little bit, but for the most part, if they did a podcast last week, they believe those things. And if those are working for them, then you should take just as many notes and be with just as much intention as if you were one-on-one with them, because it's the same thing. It's just, you got to choose to act first. And once you start to act and build your company, then that's when you get to be in their presence, because you become a contemporary and equal in some respect. Obviously, we're all learning from each other, so it's not like we're all perfectly equal, but
yeah, I like to say work until your idols become your rivals, but not really rivals, peers.
Yeah, it's more like peers. Who's been your, this is going to be the last question here, but who's been your favorite, like what's the story of how you got your favorite author to be on your podcast or to be interviewed by you?
Here's a fun one. Grant Cardone was episode number 9 on our podcast. And what I did was I leveraged The Third Door, a book by Alex Benayan about how to creatively access people. So I'm trying Grant for weeks on IG, nothing's happening. I go to one of his websites, I find an opportunity to submit a questionnaire about having him speak at your event or something. I think I checked a box that said I'd paid 25 G's. I didn't have any money to do that, by the way, but I just wanted to get them to speak to me. So they start speaking to me. I try to provide as much value as possible. I have this big audience. Grant can be in front of it. He can sell anything he wants. Nobody in my audience knows who he is. I'm trying to get at the ego a little bit. They say no about 10 times in a row. They eventually say yes to a virtual interview. So that was cool enough, right? I'm on the virtual interview with Uncle G. He's talking, he's yelling, he's having a good time. He's super controversial. Great experience. Here's the home run point. We're at the end of the interview. I say, hey, Grant, I'm going to be in Miami. By the way, I wasn't going to be in Miami. Grant, I'm going to be in Miami in the month of November. I would love to do a second interview. My audience is going to eat this up. You're going to sell a ton of books. He's like, yeah, dude, anytime. I had it recorded. So I clipped just that and I sent it to his team. And I wasn't going to be in Miami, but they picked a date. They said yes. I flew to Miami. I got to spend an afternoon with him and Elena. They were incredibly gracious. But those pictures of me hanging out with Grant in his studio, being interviewed by him, interviewing him, like that is worth so much to the business. And it happened by creatively getting in front of somebody like him. So I figured maybe we can end there because I've got a hard stop, but that's a fun example of how I got in front of Grant.
Yeah, dude, that's phenomenal. I love it. Thank you. And anybody who's interested, the link to his book will be, the pre-order will be in the show notes, but also it may be live at that point. So you can go buy it, get moving on taking action as being a book thinker, actually applying what you're learning. So thank you so much for your time, Nick. I really appreciate it. Hope you have a wonderful day.
Appreciate you, man. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. If what you heard today resonates with you, please like, comment, and share on social media. Tag me. And if you do give me a shout out, I'll give you a shout out on the next episode. Thanks to all of those who've left a review. It helps spread the message of what it takes to build a legacy that lasts. And we'll catch you next time on Fuel Your Legacy.